tonight with me, Sumita Kareer, and my colleague Nivedhana Prabhu. And tonight on the show, we put the spotlight on the West Asia conflict. Now, 2 years ago, today, October 7th, in 2023, Hamas militants launched a brutal assault on southern Israel, killing 100 people and taking 251 hostages in an act of terror that shattered lives and ignited a devastating war. Israel's response has left Gaza in ruins with over 67,000 Palestinians dead, widespread hunger and mass displacement. In fact, memorials unfold across Israel tonight, from the bloodied fields of the Nova festival to vigils in Jerusalem, where grief hangs heavy and families of the remaining captives demand answers. Nivedhana.
Absolutely. Yet amid the sorrow, glimmers of hope, because indirect talks began yesterday in Egypt and centered, of course, on President Trump's ambitious 20-point peace plan. Now, Hamas has signaled optimism, agreeing to hostage releases and key provisions, while mediators push for disarmament and troop withdrawal, steps that could end the fighting and pave the way for Gaza's reconstruction. Now, world leaders from Pope Leo to Britain's Keir Starmer echo the call for a just resolution. But as explosions still echo in Gaza, the task remains easier said than done. Will Trump's peace plan work, or will Netanyahu's insistence that there will be no Palestinian state continue to spell further doom in the region, is what we ask tonight, Sumita.
Absolutely, Nivedhana. And in fact, we'll take some of those questions to our guests who are joining us tonight. Dr. Ori Goldberg, he's the author and political commentator, is joining us from Israel. Also joining us on the panel is Mr. Manoj Joshi. He's a distinguished fellow at ORF. Thank you very much to both the gentlemen for joining us here on ET. Now, let me come to you, Mr. Ori. As far as this entire war is concerned, 2 years on after the dastardly attacks on innocent civilians at a music festival, the war still rages on. What will determine lasting peace in the region, given the fact that Donald Trump has also announced his peace plan? But will his peace plan work? Will there be lasting peace in the region?
Well, I think it's very premature to talk about peace, if peace has any meaning at all after 2 years of such devastation. I think what we need to talk about now is a halt to the killing. We need to talk about reconstruction. We need to talk about Palestinian lives. The entire population of the Gaza Strip, the UN evaluates, is now at risk of famine ranging between level 3 and level 5. So we need to talk about all of that because that is what we're concerned about. I think that the Trump plan actually does stand a chance. I think it stands a chance for two other reasons. One has to do with Israeli politics. I think it behooves Prime Minister Netanyahu to sign a deal now, because then he will be able to present himself to the Israeli public as a complete candidate. He was the one who fought the inevitable difficult war, but is also the one who is capable of signing the inevitable difficult deal. That's one reason. And should a snap election be called in Israel, which is quite likely, if he does so, he stands a good chance of winning such an election. And the second reason is precisely that we're talking about logistics now. As much as Trump wants to herald a new era in the Middle East, we've got, for the first time in 2 years, a united bloc of Arab countries, particularly the Gulf monarchies, who, following Israel's strike on Doha, the Qatari capital, find themselves afraid of Israel, not desires for expansion, but of Israel's unpredictability, of Israel's sense of impunity. And they have put their foot down as far as Trump goes, not as far as the Palestinian goes. They have explained to Trump that things need to change. So far, it seems like Trump has been listening with a keen ear, and he is more sensitive to the pressure applied on him from Arab capitals than he is from Jerusalem. For those two reasons, two very practical reasons, I think we might share some cautious optimism, because this isn't about principle, this is about political necessities.
Right. Dr. Ori, as you point that out, I'm going to come back to you as far as what that means in terms of Netanyahu's leadership as well, beg your pardon. But Mr. Joshi, let me come to you. In fact, the same question. Let's begin with your opening remark as to how you're assessing this at this point of time.
Well, I think, anything to do with a West Asian situation is extremely difficult to forecast. Meaning, who would have said, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, before this ghastly incident, the terrorist incident, that this is what would happen? So right now, we are again at that stage where just what will happen is not very clear. Because yes, President Trump has put forward a 20-point peace plan. The Israelis and the Hamas are talking over it. But I would be, you would have to be really very optimistic to see that plan be implemented in total and as soon as possible, because that is what is the need of the hour. Given the death and destruction that is being visited on Gaza, I think everyone would want peace to come as soon as possible. But the problem is that there are many, many obstacles to it, not in the least Prime Minister Netanyahu himself and his cabinet. Within his cabinet, he has people who oppose any kind of an agreement. And of course, Hamas, we don't even know where the Hamas leadership is, how they are functioning. They are with their backs to the wall.
Absolutely.
So as I said, this is a situation very difficult to forecast.
Yes. Absolutely difficult to forecast whether that's going to lead to lasting peace and what will be the next few steps as far as implementation of this 20-point peace plan is concerned. Several clarifications needed. But let me come to the point that that Mr. Goldberg essentially made. He said that there should be optimism because there is political necessity, at least on the part of Israel. So let me ask you that question, Mr. Joshi. Does Netanyahu actually want this war to end, given that far-right members of his cabinet essentially have threatened to end his coalition government if the war ends before Hamas is destroyed? And do you think Hamas is going to be destroyed and all of these conditions will be met?
Highly character. He's been Prime Minister of Israel for very long, and one of his expertise is on hanging on to power. And already many people say this conflict has carried on too long because of Mr. Netanyahu's personal needs. He is on trial in Israel on corruption charges. You see, and peace, he could be a big loser from the peace, personal loser. So, when it comes to Netanyahu, I think I would say that Trump is perhaps the only person who can handle him. And so far, he has been handling him. But let us see for how long. I'm not so sure about that.
All right, fair point that you make, Mr. Joshi. But talking about Netanyahu and also Dr. Ori, given what we were discussing earlier in your opening remarks, and look at how Netanyahu's political survival has been, including delaying his trial and managing coalition dynamics also that we're looking at. But it seems intertwined with that strategy of his. But to what extent is domestic politics shaping Israel's negotiating stance, especially at the moment in terms of what we're looking at?
Oh, I think domestic politics is probably the most important factor shaping Israel's stance in the negotiations at the moment. I don't think Netanyahu has much to lose from the peace. Consistent polling demonstrates that the majority of Israelis supports what we call an end to the war. That doesn't necessarily mean avoiding any kind of resumption of the war once the hostages are back, but at least at the initial stage, an end to the war. And Netanyahu and his hard right ministers, the settler religious ministers, have never been natural allies. They've never trusted him, and he's never actually trusted them. They've already toppled one of his governments. And I think what Netanyahu is understanding at the moment is that there are two sea changes in the making. The first is really that the Israeli public has tired of this war. Again, the Israeli public is not tired of trying to destroy Hamas, despite the fact that Israel has abjectly failed to do precisely that over 2 years. The Israeli public still supports the government's actions in Gaza, but the Israeli public does not support the war. The war is making life in Israel very, very difficult economically, socially. Israel's global status is eroding as quickly as we can speak about it. So Netanyahu realizes that. And I also think Netanyahu understands that there has been somewhat of a change of heart in Washington. I think Trump has had enough. As far as Trump is concerned, he has allowed Netanyahu a very long leash. And I don't know if you recall this, but Trump surely does. During Trump's first term, the New York Times published a cartoon showing Netanyahu leading Trump on a leash. Trump certainly remembers that. He does not like Netanyahu, and he doesn't trust Netanyahu. He's let Netanyahu have a lot of leeway to go forth and carry out this quote
Right.
unquote war, but this war is failing. Israel has not been able
Right.
to destroy Hamas. Instead, Israel has committed war crimes and crimes
And
against
it's not been
humanity
able
in
to
the
achieve the objectives as well of the attack that it's mounted on the several stakeholders involved in this war, Mr. Goldberg. So let me ask you a follow-up question to that. Now, one of the points as far as this peace plan is concerned involves the Israeli withdrawal from annexed territories. Hamas has said that there is no clear timeline to that. What if Israel reneges is the big question that everybody has been wondering about, given what's happening in Israel. What if Israel reneges, and is there a possibility that you see over the next couple of months for that to happen?
Well, this isn't a theoretical question. Israel has already done that. There was a ceasefire in place in March of this year, and Israel reneged on that ceasefire, violated it, and began a stage of hostilities that has been much more violent and murderous than before. So Hamas is right in asking that. But again, times have changed. Israel's status is not as powerful as it was even 3 or 4 months ago. Israel's global standing has eroded. Israel is now considered a liability in Europe, and even among growing parties in the United States, Israel is now considered a liability and not an ally who should be protected at all costs. Again, optimism should be cautious because Israel does enjoy a special standing in the United States, but Trump is not as ideologically obliged to Israel as his predecessor, Joe Biden, was. Trump cares about Trump. Trump cares about what nakedly American interests. And as far as he can see, Israel is bleeding the United States dry. And in fact, that's criticism that's being levied at Trump from the ranks of his own party. So again, I am optimistic not because I think the world sees reason or suddenly cares about the plight of the Palestinians. I'm optimistic because political necessity seems to be converging upon this conflict, everyone for their own reasons. Trump for his and Netanyahu for his. When they come together, I would expect at least a preliminary deal to be signed in the very near future.
All right, but that, of course, remains to be seen if that's going to pan out the way that you have pointed out, Dr. Ori. But Mr. Joshi, let me take this to you. Given what we're looking at over here, more importantly, we understand that a particular poll was also held very recently in terms of the evolving situation as well. And in fact, talking about that, and what it in fact states is that 2/3 of Israelis want the war to end. This is, of course, largely due to hostages, yet opinions are sharply divided on Netanyahu's leadership. So how do you think, public sentiment will be also influencing what we're looking at here?
Well, public sentiment, obviously. But, the thing is that I'm not so sure that the Israelis really know, meaning the average Israeli really knows what has happened in Gaza. There's been a lot of self-censorship from whatever I gather. I don't read Israeli newspapers, but from whatever I've read, there has not been very accurate reporting. There is a limit in the kind of information that has been released to the average Israeli. So they don't really know. I'm not so sure to what extent they are aware of how much ground they have lost in international opinion. Today 157 countries recognize the so-called Palestinian state. And as was rightly pointed out by Mr. Goldberg, that the countries of Europe, countries like Netherlands, Britain, have seen large pro-Palestinian protests. See, back in the 70s and 80s, the Palestinians used to be accused of terrorism, and they were charged with terrorism and terrorist activities. Today, we see a very different mood. both, especially in Europe and other parts of the world. Look at Spain, for example, very strong opinions against Israel. France, another country. So what I'm trying to say is that I'm not so sure that the Israelis have quite grasped that and to what extent this has been reflected in the Israeli media and what they understand. I'm not so sure of the kind of censorship that is there, whether there is war censorship or not. I'm not, again, not very clear on that. But I do know that they
Right.
have not been, they're not fully aware of what has happened in Gaza.
Right, Mr. Joshi, let me ask you another follow-up question, since we're talking about domestic politics and how there is political pressure on both the sides, whether you look at Netanyahu or you look at Donald Trump. He is under pressure to bring an end to both the wars that are currently raging. But will the pressure of Donald Trump, will the U.S. pressure work on Netanyahu, given the fact that Israel did attack Qatar and then it kept bombing Iran despite the United States telling it not to, and end that bombing?
Look, let's be very clear. If Mr. Trump is consistent, Mr. Netanyahu has no choice. Israel cannot do without US support. Meaning, as it is, what we have just been pointing out, that Israel is losing support right across Europe. So to take on Mr. Trump at this stage would be fatal for them. They just would not be able to manage it. But that, of course, as I said, depends on Trump's consistency. The problem with Trump is that he may lose, interest at some point. His ways are very erratic, and so therefore, my response to you is qualified by saying that if Trump is consistent in his in pushing his plan, that he has, I must say to his credit that he has brought, at least he has come this far with this. If he's consistent with it, Israel will have to bend.
All right. And in fact, talking about Trump and that 20-point plan that has, of course, in his opinion, providing a framework, Dr. Ori, I want to take that to you. You know, when you're talking about that 20-point plan as well, it leaves major issues unresolved, whether it's disarmament, the foreign administration, and Gaza's governance. And in, your opinion, how realistic is it to expect a sustainable, rather peace under these conditions?
Again, I think the purpose of the plan is not to provide a detailed framework that can be implemented from day one. The purpose of the plan is to present a document that is serious enough and weighty enough to get the sides to begin negotiating over the mid and long term, and to get a process in place where these things can be hashed out. I think the purpose of putting forward a 20-point plan is to say, hey, I'm a serious-minded person. I've taken all the major issues under consideration, not much more. But the truth of the matter is that there is not much room for debate. It's very clear to all sides involved what the controversial points are and what steps must be taken in order to end the bloodshed. Israel needs to withdraw from Gaza. Hamas needs to leave power, to disarm, and perhaps to go into exile because it will not be destroyed. Israel needs to provide sound guarantees that it will not renege on its promises, that it will not renege on its commitments. Hamas needs to provide similar guarantees that it will not attempt to embark on any sort of future attacks to destroy Israel. And Gaza needs to be reconstructed, and that side everybody agrees. There are a lot of political egos at
Absolutely.
stake here. There's a lot of posturing. We will hear a
Right.
lot of bombastic statements, but the points that need to be hashed out are very clear.
Absolutely. And Dr. Goldberg, we'll have to see how those points are addressed over the next couple of months. But let me talk to you about one of the points that you essentially mentioned, which is about Hamas agreeing to releasing hostages and demilitarized tunnel structures. Now, you know that Hamas has previously refused to lay down its weapons, saying that it would only do so if a Palestinian state gets established, which Israel is essentially opposed to. So how do you think this point about releasing hostages, how will this point see implementation?
Well, I think Hamas has already agreed several times to release all the hostages at once in return for only a schedule that would detail Israeli withdrawal stages from the Gaza Strip, no more. Hamas wants this war to end as much as Israel wants it to end. Hamas has, in a way, uh, defeated Israel because it has not allowed Israel to achieve its objectives, but it has also brought ruin and devastation on its people, and it does not see an immediate political future for itself. So, again, I think the hostage issue is probably the easiest. In fact, the main difficulty with it has to be figuring out where the hostages are, which is something Israel does not publicly reckon with. But the condition of the hostages is very much to do with the relentless bombing of the Gaza Strip by Israel, as it has to do with their treatment by Hamas. So again, Israel has to relent, at least initially, and it has not done so, by the way. Trump's statement was Israel will stop the bombing the minute Hamas begins to work towards releasing the hostages. That has not happened. An average of 80 to 100 Palestinians continue to be killed by Israel every day. So we're seeing the beginning of a long, bloody, difficult, convoluted process. And the only reason to think that some good may come of it, that the organized killing, the systematic killing will stop, that aid will flood the besieged strip and Palestinians can be provided this aid under suitable conditions, is that it behooves leaders on both sides to do so for interests that are their own as much as they are collective.
As you pointed out, let me take this across to beg your pardon, to Mr. Joshi. Mr. Joshi, we heard what Dr. Ori had to say, but more importantly, I want to understand from your vantage point, if these talks fail or are delayed, what are the most likely scenarios for escalation, and how does that really shape the strategic plan going forward, given all that we've seen so far and the challenges, of course, that you were also putting into perspective earlier?
Well, you see, I can't see any escalation. We are already at the highest escalation. The Israeli Defense Forces are operating in Gaza. They will continue to do so, I presume. I'm actually surprised by the fact that they have not been able to actually find the hostages. They've not been able to destroy Hamas till now. Gaza is a pretty small place. I don't know what the circumstances are out there. But I don't think there can be any further escalation. Meaning, escalation means that if Gaza has been leveled, 70% of Gaza has been leveled, so we may see 100% of Gaza leveled. So I think that could be the level of escalation. And of course, the poor hostages, one can't say anything because they'd probably be killed or they die in the process of a continuing war. So contemplating a situation where this war continues is, I think, too terrible to contemplate at this stage. So I do think that this is the beginning of a process. It is the beginning of a very difficult process. It is the beginning of a process which may eventually yield a Palestinian state or a state of Israel where Palestinians and Jews can live together. Meaning it's entirely possible. Right now, the situation is in a huge state of flux. There is, it's not just Gaza in the sights of the right wing in Israel, it's also the West Bank, which they want to occupy. Now, if all that happens, you can contemplate in some future, not in the next maybe even 10 years or even 15, 20 years, but there could be a situation where eventually this is worked out between the Palestinians and the Israelis themselves. They will have to work it out.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, they will simply kill each other.
Absolutely. Absolutely, which is something that we've seen over the past couple of years, Mr. Joshi. But on that note, thank you very much, gentlemen, for taking the time out and speaking to us here on ET Now. In the end, the task remains easier said than done. It remains to be seen whether Trump's peace plan is going to work on Netanyahu's insistence that there will be no Palestinian state. That will continue to spell further doom in the region. Thank you very much, gentlemen, once again for taking the time out and speaking to us here on ET Now. For the moment, ladies and gentlemen, it's time now for us to step into a very short commercial break. Lots more coming up on the other side. Stay tuned.